Hello everyone, thank you for coming again to our CSIRO talks, well, CSIRO YouTube talks. And today we have Dr. JB giving us a talk about the livelihood diversification benefits of humans and nature in forest commons. Thank you, JB.
Thanks. So, thanks for coming. Oh, it's working. Yeah, thanks. So, thanks for coming first. So, you will recognize that the diversity of life and of ecosystem services are. So the planet is full of life and ecosystem services, and has been discovered also progressively that they are inextricably linked to the diversity of ways people through time across the planet. And unfortunately, this diversity of decision making has been reduced through time to cost effectively feed, shelter, and protect vulnerable humans and growing human populations. So this process has been acknowledged that it started early in the process since the beginning of agriculture, etc. But it really intensified. The process started to be intensified in the 16th century with the British Agricultural Revolution. People really wanted to start rationalizing the process of feeding people that were starving, or to protect them, to build boats for war, etc. So in France, a lot of forests have been planted in the 17th century, monospecific stands to build warships. So because governments wanted really to protect their population, and they massively transformed the landscape. They simplified it. So you can recognize some of this landscape currently in different parts of the world. They become more coarse-grained landscapes with different clear separated zones. And in each zone, you've got one ecosystem service. You've got one species per zone for one objective. And to achieve that, of course, government had to build governance system that were attached to that, and that forced more centralization of the decision-making process with a clear chain of commands, industrialization, and the zoning was organized by the state, and you had the right of big private companies inside progressively, so it becomes more in the 19th, 20th century. And of course, the consequence of that you had a lower diversity of factors, mainly state or private agents or corporations in those simplified landscapes. And on the top of that, they had to build government new types of economies to support the industrialization process that were more specialized and supported by efficient market channels. So this transformation had a lot of benefits, of course. Apart from that, I avoid famine in different countries. So the Green Revolution was exceptionally important for this growing population, but they had also negative impacts. And we all know all the people who are working on biodiversity, or on anthropologists working on knowledge, belief practices, etc., or sociologists know that there were huge loss in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services, problem of equity, access to different resources. So you build massive monospecific landscape, you kick out people from the land, or you force them to get some jobs. Specialization also, you see in the US, but that's a monospecific stand, one species. These crops just could be very vulnerable to climate hazards or to pests. So you could destroy literally the local economy by simply having lost all your single crop you relied on. And economically, we started to see, even with the financial crisis, like the price of some commodities just dropped massively. And if you rely only locally on this crop, well, you're pretty doomed economically. So, like it was the example of lumber here, that was even not following at all the Standard & Poor index. So, of course, people were not stupid. They realized it pretty quickly. So they started to think about ways of building strategies to make sure to restore a certain balance between human and nature imperatives. And one of the simple way of doing it was to realize that we need economic outputs for sure, and private industry will not disappear. So we can still allocate them a zone for them, and they will try to work with science, etc., to find optimal sustainable yield on practices by finding more robust crops that are more destructive for the environment, that are more resilient to economic hazards, etc. And so a place where you could provide provisioning services, another one where you could conserve, and that the state was managing that. And sometimes with the locals now, we start to integrate them that we're living there, because they have the knowledge for that. But it's mainly to protect biodiversity and not to produce provisioning services, but more supporting services, regulating services, and cultural services. And another zone for local communities where, yeah, they need to live. So they need to have access to some resources. So for equity purposes, we allocate them a zone, and they can live there. Whatever they're doing on biodiversity or economy, they want it, so they will get it, at least a bit of that. And so we acknowledge at that time that still that there are trade-offs between those different objectives on these different zones, and that we could work on a certain way to optimally allocate those different zones. And that's very handy because there are very fantastic tools to work on that. Marks and with zone, zonation, etc. are awesome tools to deal with that, and at least to make sure that spatially we can build and restore a certain balance between nature and human objectives. But in the process was very interesting because by giving people a certain right to live, science, we discovered that locations where local communities could still operate freely, well, livelihood activities could be associated with high biodiversity and ecosystem services. And a lot of work from Aaron Agro and or other scientists just were just very important in the story, and still now. And it's very funny that he just started to analyze how those communities were operating, where they had very clear institutions that were designed around communities and a diversity of local actors, and they retained some knowledge really from practices. And on those lands were really productive, biodiverse, and could produce a lot of carbon. So it was not that bad. It was just a very interesting discovery. And sometimes those lands were even more productive or more biodiverse than the conservation area that we designed and where we kicked out a few decades ago the people who were living there. And the other side of the spectrum, when those people were forced to leave or had no choice than to leave because they had no job or they were forced by rule being kicked out of some area, there was some expectation that the land will recover and the biodiversity will recover. And it was not always the case. It was the case sometimes, but not always. And sometimes you could see the ecosystem was trapped into a state that it was not the final state we were expecting, not a forest, but it could be a forest, but it was full of weeds sometimes. And and so the biodiversity was dropping, the productivity of the soil was dropping also, and the carbon sequestration was not that great. So those two things, so one of the consequences you could see in the literature is that does it mean that human can do good for nature in some context? We published recently with Yadin and with the team a paper that explain how human harvesting or thinning or planting activities can benefit carbon and biodiversity. Basically, that had quite interesting. We received quite interesting feedbacks about that paper. And what we show in this paper is that productivity and biodiversity can be compatible and even could be recommended in some lands, but are context specific, depends on the climate context and the landscape context. And sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better, but we could start to discover some rules for that. But to achieve this, it's not simply just planting stuff or just letting nature do this. We need sometimes to adapt the management practices to the local context. And by doing so, we could see that sparing wilderness from production and human communities may not always be justified. It could be suboptimal in some instances in terms of yield, production, biodiversity, and carbon. And the thing that we found that in terms of practices is that we have to work on building complementarities between species plant functional traits by creating disturbances through planting and harvesting to achieve a very good output more systematically. So that's one possible explanation to understand why local communities could do differently, are doing differently in space in different contexts, but still are doing well in different places. So okay, but that's a good stuff. It was theoretical stuff. But in practice, how communities organize their land to find synergies between production and conservation purposes? Well, there are three ways actually that we could see. So I choose, for the sake of visual presentation, to start from the visual stuff that we could see in the landscape. So the landscape is a good start. We can see that some landscapes are very heterogeneous, and there are some communities who played with a bidimensional space and time by producing complexity in the landscape, and others play with a third dimension and time to produce complexity, and others just combine those strategies. But under the hood, under those spatial considerations, you can see that people are to create agroecological, economic, and institutional strategies to enforce and incentivize clear decision-making rules, like some clear rules were organized. For instance, in heterogeneous landscapes, some of them are very resilient and biodiverse, others are just shit. Sorry. Sorry for the word. It's recorded. I will be very careful. So decision-making in this landscape has been designed to build a diversified and resilient economy, not focused on multiple use and production of different ecosystem services. You can see that in those areas, those multiple use and ecosystem services are supported by a diversity of market channels. And you've got also they produce a huge spatial and temporal heterogeneity. They farmers, for instance, in their own land, so you've got private land ownership in those lands here, and you could have commons here. But in their land, they started to create rotation system with complementarity between crops and spatial heterogeneity with different crops through space. But all of this just started to fragment the land, but they found through time that they should cooperate to connect the natural elements like hedgerows, etc., to create first boundaries between properties, but also to build complementarities between the service from nature on hedgerows, sunken lanes with hedgerows, or wood patches or forest commons. They found that they could bring services like windbreaking, pollination, just pest control with biocontrol agents, and also wood or fruit and food. So they started to realize that nature could bring services to the crop, and they build also complementarity between crops. For forest commons, that's even more complicated. So decision making also has been built on the same economic and diversification background for some areas, but they build it on the third dimension by stratifying vegetation communities. So you could see on some forest commons that it could be very simplified forest where you have two layers only, but others are very complex. And to manage this complexity, people just started to cooperate as communities by managing the timing between harvest, by building synergies between species. And in those systems, it's even more integrated. They understand that nature can provide services for their crops, but by harvesting their crop, they could also provide benefits for nature. It was a two-way around process, so it has been proven in several studies. And others just created even more complex stuff in mixing zoning, commons, and heterogeneity in the landscape. So overall, we can find common denominators for this successful socio-ecological system. So non-exhaustively, you can find that decision-making and institutions are more decentralized, so they can make decisions locally, those decisions can be made collectively on some key ecosystem elements or crops. So that's one common denominator, is that they are not working only individually. They have to cooperate on some key elements. And livelihood activities and the provisioning of ecosystem services also directly or indirectly without being aware of it sometimes, but sometimes they are aware of it, that the provisioning of ecosystem services, the fact of harvesting, can benefit certain aspects of biodiversity. They have also very diversified livelihoods and economies and ecosystem services. They have a neglected niche markets. They are harvesting small stuff that could be of importance. And they have economic structures that support these ecosystem services and niche markets. So you have different diversity of market channels, and also what is called the vertical integration of supply chain, where local people not only harvest, but also they control the next step, what they are doing with the harvest, the transformation, building something a bit more a cultural tool or something that they could sell, and not only cutting the wood and just letting them as a lumber and wait for another company doing the stuff, etc. So, well, that's good news. Economic diversification that we talked about just before, the fact that they diversify their way of living. A lot of policies have been organized, were in the agenda of many countries since several decades. So it's not everywhere, and it was difficult or never applied. You could see like the Tasmanian Forest Agreement, economic diversification. So it's not in the agenda anymore. So why economic diversification is not mainstream in all countries and everywhere, or just stopped? Well, you have to put yourself in government's shoes, and we can understand easily their point. The government is accountable for a lot of things, and it looks pretty risky to entrust a more diverse portfolio of species to manage, harvest, and sell to local communities. So it's not necessarily sure that delegating those rights can mechanistically generate and sustain higher livelihood, higher biodiversity, and higher quality in terms of ecosystem services on the long term. Mines at the beginning of the presentation, there is a strong history, especially, well, everywhere in the world with a history of starvation and wars. So it's legitimate that government want to control and be sure that they produce the food. They keep biodiversity and avoid wars. So in a sense, it looks legitimate and safer to tell local communities what to do, to control a bit them, and send state agents to ensure optimal outputs. And now we have to reduce the cost, and the state is too expensive, so we can work with private industry to reduce costs. So it will always be like that for some stuff, and that's important to do like that. But those communities were not necessarily working like that, and sometimes they work very well. And there are some claims from them to respect their way of doing so. But there is a fourth thing, that how much economic diversity is enough? Like, do we need to completely diversify and build like zillions of products? Do we be like, should we be all like Switzerland, producing a lot of chocolate boxes, a lot of timber stuff, and very cool stuff, and many like that? Well, the fact is that it's a very difficult question, given that the more diversified the local economy, the more difficult it becomes to build cost-efficient market channels. So it's very efficient to have one market channel to support acacia, or to support only growing pine, or those things. But diversifying the economy means that people who are the middlemen who are buying the things and supplying to the people, imagine they will have one person 20 kilometers and another 10 kilometers. Imagine for the milk, someone who is taking the milk from the farmer at different places. It means that the more you have different small microeconomies, the more those middlemen have to drive a long way to get them. So it starts to be very complicated and expensive, etc. So if you diversify too much, you expect that it's not working very well. But still, there is governments want to achieve that. So I try to answer these questions for Forest Commons. And first, I built the modeling framework that reflects the link between economic diversification and actual people's behavior. So I went into the econometric literature to know quantitatively how people are behaving for different social, institutional, economic, and cultural systems, in terms of how much they are harvesting for timber, which species they are choosing, what the probability of choosing one size of one species, what the quantity they will harvest for timber, for fuel wood also, and what do they need in practice in different countries for different households. And in terms of silvicultural practices, also the behaviors in terms of usually what is a normal weeding effort, given some characteristics of the land or how you are organized as a community. How much effort you put in planting, what type of species usually you are planting, and the monitoring effort. And I had, after I plugged this model with a model we published recently on the forest ecosystem dynamic model that can predict the dynamic of a forest and the biodiversity of the forest given the plant function traits of the species and the climate characteristics, the quantity of water, so the etc. and competition for light, etc. And we built also a model of, in this previous paper, a performance model where I plug here, and that can evaluate different scenarios and predict the organic carbon above ground in the soil, the total organic carbon, the biodiversity of the system, and the revenue in terms of timber, the supply of timber, the revenue, and the firewood supply. based on all those behaviors. So I built different scenarios of economic diversification and then simplified the question for 8 types of species. So, and each species is uniquely defined by their plant functional traits. So you imagine the size of the tree, the leaf mass per area, how thick is the plant, that defines the physiology of carbon sequestration and how fast it will grow in different light environments. Or the timber density that defines the survival and also how likely it will be harvested. So denser timber are preferred by local people for firewood, and they cost you get more money out of it for timber. So I built all the possible combinations of species harvesting. So 0 species, 1 species, species 1, or species 2, or species 3, or species 8, 2 species, 3 species, and all the possible combination for different climate scenarios. And on lowland forest, I choose lowland forest because that's a typical case where it's very biodiverse. We know that there are a lot of problems and issues. All the results that are after doesn't mean that it will work on dry lands. So the first result is that we can see easily that there is no clear relationship between biodiversity and carbon sequestration. It's not because people, for instance, are trying to increase biodiversity, let's say, that they will get automatically higher carbon in the forest, and the other way around. So it's quite complex relationship. It can be a trade-off. It can be synergy. There are areas where you can take the two, and others where you have one. So this is quite a mess, actually. So, but can we extract order out of this mess? Well, that's very interesting. If you let people blindly harvest or blindly choose a higher diversity of species, so from 0 not harvesting to 8 species harvested, and you let them choosing whatever they want, actually it's increasing. The more you diversify your portfolio of species harvested, the more likely you will be to have the opportunity to harvest a higher quantity of timber on 100 years. So you've got the system is more productive, so you can harvest more, and you get more out. You're making more money out of it on the long term. The other results still is that harvesting blindly a higher diversity of species increases the long-term biodiversity, but not necessarily carbon sequestration, or the carbon stock. Sorry, not sequestration. So basically, here you don't harvest. It's the equivalent of a protected forest. It's the baseline. It's where the biodiversity is maximum. If you harvest 1 species, on average, one of the 8 species, on average, you will lose pretty much 80% of your biodiversity. But if you're increasing the diversity of species you're harvesting, you're more likely to reach a high level of biodiversity. So basically what's happening is that you're harvesting different species with different plant functional traits. So you're creating different niches or different opportunities for species to come and to colonize. So you give more species opportunity to be there, and you increase biodiversity. So we prove that in the other paper. That's an underlying mechanism that we prove. But that's not what's happening for carbon stock. If you have higher diversity of harvesting, you will not get very productive necessarily forest. Here, that's the equivalent of the baseline protected forest. Imagine there is no disturbance, no hurricanes, no fire that will open the canopy and allow regeneration of the biomass. So, of course, you will not expect to get a very productive system. That's what's happening if you diversify too much your portfolio of species harvested. The best thing is to focus basically on 1 species, and the right one, and you get a lot of carbon. So that's the same as previously, the line here, and I added two other scenarios that correspond to imposing constraints on blind economic diversification. And this can have negative or positive impact. The blue one, the blue scenario, is a restriction on never harvesting the highest yield species. So of course, if you don't harvest the highest yield species, you will not you will not supply a lot of timber, you will not get a lot of timber, and you will not get a lot of money. So that makes sense. And if you always harvest, if you have in your mix of species you're harvesting, always the highest yield species, of course, you will reach more quickly higher timber supply, and you will make more money. And for biodiversity of carbon, what the consequence is that if you don't harvest the highest yield species, you can find solutions that are less good than the blind solution. Simply, the reason for that is that the highest yield species become the dominant species. So if you don't harvest it, you're more likely to let this species dominating the mix of species. But if you harvest it, you can get more diversity at an intermediate level of economic diversification. And for carbon sequestration, not harvesting the highest yield species, of course, you will get more carbon. But if you always harvest, you will get lower carbon, but by increasing the diversity of species harvested, you can reach a standard level of carbon stock. So it's increasing, it's positively correlating in this case. So how would this performance compare with a land-sparing system? So basically it was a forest commons, so different people are all together in the same area, and they are working on the different species on the third dimension vertically, or choosing their species. And how does it compare to a non-industrial system, like let's say Europe here? And imagine rather than having pastures, you've got different stands of different timber species. Whether it's better to have, let's say, a big area for biodiversity here, and different stands, and here with one species to choose. So I compare different scenarios, and so here at the top, the gray bar is the equivalent of harvesting one species only, not 8. So it was previously, it was harvesting only one species here. And how does it compare for an objective of maximizing timber supply? So you try to reach, the question is, how much land can you protect, convert into a conservation area? And the other part of the land is for supplying timber, the same quantity that you can find in the forest common. Well, this land sharing system in gray is equivalent to the best case for this type of species, given those non-functional traits in terms of timber density, distance per area, etc. So this is equivalent as protecting 90% of the land as conservation area. That's pretty good. Yeah. So of course you would prefer sparing the land and protecting 90% of the area. Well, it's not a lot of timber produced here, but still it means that land sharing is just absolutely not good in this case. And sparing is very good. But if you not harvest 1 but 8, based on the previous one, the previous result that I showed, if you harvest 8 species blindly, the equivalent in terms of timber supply is that you have to convert 90% of the land in monospecific stand, and you have only 10% of the land as a conservation area. You retain 100% of your pool of species here, and here the forest common, you have between 73% and 85% in this case for this scenario here. So it's as good as that for land sharing as in Spain, for this case, for timber supply, but you have less area for conservation, but you still have more species in this remaining patch here, while in the remaining zone. And for carbon stock, the overall carbon stock of the system in the land sharing system is better than in the land sparing system. So you see there is no perfect solution. Land sharing in this case is arguably better in some aspects. The only problem is that you don't retain everything in terms of biodiversity in the land sharing system compared to here. You've got, you don't have a lot of land, but you have all your pool of diversity. I don't account for migration purposes, so I guess that if this is a single patch and this matches the requirement of the species, this is perfect, but if this is small patches, organized in small patches, 10% of small patches is not likely to be good for biodiversity anyway. So to wrap up, the first thing is that I found that economic diversification could drive positively some livelihood, biodiversity and ecosystem services outputs. We have, in science, we have worked in the last decade since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the new IPBES on the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services. I think there is an extension, easy extension, is to maybe include some diversification components, and why not starting by economic diversification or livelihood diversification. That is in the agenda of some countries. Why not, as a like scientist, could be a good idea for scientists to work on the food chain and working on knowing more whether by increasing economic diversity we can get things better outputs in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I found that blind diversification of timber harvesting economy can be better than specialized economy for biodiversity and livelihoods and depends for carbon. That's a more complicated story. And harvesting high yield species can further increase co-benefits in both paired and shared land. So spare land system with higher yield species harvested, it's well known, we know that. It's better to intensify the land with high yield species and to protect other areas for biodiversity. It has been the way to do since the Green Revolution. But I prove that on shared system too. And the thing is that I show that land sparing is as good or arguably better than land sparing systems. So maybe there may be no need to force one or the other. So if in an area there is traditionally people who are organized as communities and work since 100 years or millennium with forest commons, why should we impose them to leave the land, stop harvesting stuff in it, and being outside? There are some other good arguments for some to ask them to stop some activities, like for I'm dealing with plant biodiversity, but I'm not dealing with mammals. There are some endangered species like the tiger or whatever. This is a different story. I'm just talking about plant species here. But for plant species, that's one strong argument to not necessarily force people to choose one economic system and landscape system or the other one, and more to respect their way of doing. The second finding is that for some landscapes show that nature and people can be compatible and may be recommended to gain some form of resilience in the long term. I speak about resilience here because in the scenarios I include climate change in it and climate variability, and so the results take into account those drastic changes. So confirm that entrusting to communities a more diverse portfolio of non-threatened species to manage, harvest and sell for timber and fuel wood could paradoxically co-benefit long-term biodiversity, carbon biomass and harvesting incomes. I know that it sounds like a bit weird for conservationists, that harvesting stuff in the wild can improve biodiversity. But you have to think about, for forests, for instance, if you harvest one species, for instance, a dominant species, you open light gaps, you open niches, you create complementarities, and you give opportunities to other species to colonize. So that's the way the things are working in forest. And of course, those things need to be tested in the field and I think explored in other systems and contexts. But another finding is that for some landscapes, we may need to change the level at which we design prioritization plan. So for biodiversity and ecosystem services, now we know that there are diversity of factors and practices that can generate those services and that can protect this biodiversity. Sometimes they are not good. Some practices are just absolutely not adapted, and others were adapted, and governments, because of needs or colonization or war or whatever, or for needs of society, just reduce this diversity of factors, and it was not necessarily good, but those actors were linked, producing a diversity of ecosystem services that were linked to diverse market channels. The way of doing since the 16th century was to focus more on some essential species that could provide quickly food to people, building boats, shelter, etc. So fast-growing species for forest, mostly. And that had consequences, we know, on ecosystem services, the diversity of factors and biodiversity. And to do that at the beginning, we started to work on ways of keeping the system like that and try to find ways of find optimal solutions, or and we still need to do that. We need always to try to find ways of better improving the management of biodiversity or directly ecosystem services by cropping some services, like cropping one species. But that's not what I was talking here. It's more about trying to see whether we can, by increasing the diversity of market channels, we know that in many cases it will naturally increase the diversity of factors and practices. And I tested whether it could be good for biodiversity and ecosystem services on the long term. So basically, trying to see whether we can move along the supply chain from upstream, from the species that we are harvesting, and downstream in those by creating products and supply them to the population and the consumers. Whether we can simply move the prioritization and optimization procedures, for instance, for us in the team, to those type of questions rather than focusing only here. We always need to focus here, but what if we focus here? What would be the consequences? Maybe it's an interesting way of saying that we work on the middleman in the market channels, on the suppliers. We try to build efficient market channels, how to build them cost efficiently, and sometimes we can let them doing the things, protecting biodiversity, ecosystem services, and they will get good livelihood outcomes rather than telling them what to do. You should do that. And so we will always need to do that for some problems. But if we can avoid doing it, why not working more downstream? So here it's just that there are some questions I have personally about whether we can build a prioritization plan directly on the diversity of factors, because it's not sure that what I found here in this system, by increasing the diversity of factors that are harvesting a species, you will automatically produce more biodiversity. So the relationship between diversity of factors or economic diversification, I find it positively correlated with biodiversity, but it's not sure that I can find that everywhere in all systems. So there may be some questions of there will be trade-off between people needs, etc. Of course, and that's frequently what is seen in different landscapes. So we will still need to do that. So what's next? The first thing is I'm working on extended those ideas. So I'm working with to manage to find ways of managing ecosystem services by managing boundaries of other dimension of what is called now cultural diversity. Economic diversity is one dimension of cultural diversity. You've got actor or institutional diversity or linguistic diversity or associated knowledge, belief, and practices. And I'm working now on with Bruce Taylor on the institutional diversification and to understand whether it can produce higher biodiversity or ecosystem services. Not all the type of diversification of institution can work. So the question is really what type of diversification. So locally we can call that I'm working on polycentricity, it's called. So you've got different institutions that could cooperate, and whether some form of cooperation that are more diverse could produce higher biodiversity or ecosystem services. It reminds me a bit what Jonathan presented in another in his seminar a few weeks ago with what Yadin is doing. It's more a network way of processing. It's more, it's not a network way of processing. It's a bit different. And I'm working also on those aspects of knowledge, belief, and practices. So that's easy to integrate that in the model. And even the language is surprisingly very easy to understand those relationships. So what I'm trying to do a bit is building a quantitative framework for dealing with what is called now biocultural diversity. And the second extension is that can we build really, I'm interested by building optimization tools that can facilitate shared decision making for these biocultural systems. So you've got aspects of cultural diversity like economic diversification, we saw here, that are not always simply correlated with higher biodiversity and ecosystem services. So you expect some conflicts between actors, of course. But for this system where human and nature are linked, top-down prescriptions are not, I should not say not an option, but in some cases it's absolutely not an option. In others, you can think of it, but it's not always an option. So there are some tools like structured decision making that is used, and expert elicitation, etc. And that's they are very good tools. But what if we could create optimization tools that get the where we could benefit from the strong mathematical background from and theory, and that could become just an extension of decision making of local communities and not the other way around. So that's what I'm trying to do on this aspect. So I'm working with Yann Dujardin on that. He's a CSIRO postdoc and supervised by Yadin Shades. And we're trying to create an interactive, so Yann created optimization during his PhD, an optimization procedure to integrate stakeholder and to drive the optimization procedure. And we are trying to extend this approach by integrating a diversity of factors, a diversity of objectives. So that's what he had also was dealing with diversity of objectives. So we are trying to extend that by including the diversity of factors and the diversity of local knowledge, belief, practices, and constraints. So, and the goal is that this those people with their diversity will drive the discovery of optimal preferences. And our goal is to see whether we can update also scientific knowledge through that or discover new questions from them. So that's one of the questions I would like to test with that. And I would like to apply that to, we think that a watershed system could be a very interesting approach that's very relevant to Australia, but to other countries also. Watershed are characterized by gradients of zones. So imagine conservation area on the top of the mountain, you've got industrial forests, you've got secondary forests for the commons, you've got farms and cities, and you've got other aquaculture on the barrier reef, for instance, and you've got water that is flowing, and each zone can provide different services, like in other countries, snow belt, erosion protection, and each zone and the actors who are acting in these different zones can have positive or negative impact on the different people living or depending on the other zones in the catchment. And that's trying to structure those methods around this example that I'm interested. And the second thing is I really would like to know whether more diversity is better to reach a better optimal consensus. So if we have more people and more diversity of people that we work with those optimization methods, can we reach optimal solutions faster, or is it a problem really? So that's this will be the next talk. Hope maybe in a year or 2 years, I don't know. So I would like to thank really the funding agencies, the ex-climate adaptation flagship. I worked with them, the CSIRO Land and Water, the National Environmental Research Program. I received money from SEED. I was very grateful for that, through Josie Caroline. And the conservation decision team. So I give the link here. There are some awesome things about decision making, and I say that you all know that, but I say that it's recorded. And of course, I would like to those ideas. I just have a bit of self-promotion, of course. We are discussing. There are several people who are working on those type of things and discussing in science communities. So the community of biocultural diversity and seascape. So I'm giving the link if you are interested by this type of discussion and approaches. So thank you very much for trying to understand me. That's the first time I'm presenting that, so it's a bit difficult. And I'm happy for some questions if you're not sleeping.
I have a question from the internet. So the question is, could you kindly explain what blind diversification of timber harvesting entails?
Yes, thanks for the question, anonymous person. So he has a name? This person has a name?
Sean Campbell.
Oh, Sean Campbell, okay. Well, Sean, the blind diversification means that imagine people are choosing, so there is a community of people working in forests, and just one person or the group is choosing one species randomly. So, okay, I'm choosing this species because I like it. I want to harvest it. And imagine those people are deciding to harvest more species, either individually or as a group. And you can see that sometimes in some forests, people are choosing different species, but they are not in one patch of forest, and other people are choosing other species for completely other reason. So statistically, you can say that they are randomly choosing those species. It's a statistical term. So So sorry, oh man. So basically here, choosing randomly one species is that you choose one species out of the 8. You don't because it's because if it's of interest. And here you select 7 species, and you let one, and other people will select other 7 species, not necessarily the 7 same species. So at least 6 out of 7 would be. So it means simply that. I don't know how to explain exactly.
It's not a strategic.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Awesome word. 2 words. Yelin just summarized everything. It's not a strategic selection.
How easy do you think it would be to go back from a very sort of top-down type of management structure that many developing countries developed countries have now, very sort of corporate-oriented, back to, I say back, I mean, if you move from that state of affairs to a more diverse situation, are there good examples of where that's actually happened?
So first, I'm not a political ecologist, so I will let political ecologist Ryan is here, maybe will have a good answer for that. Second, it's not necessarily, surprisingly, in developed countries that you have more local management and decentralized management. Colonization forced really a top-down system with centralized system. Red Plus was a risk recently. So Red Plus, we centralized decision-making on the top in developing countries because they wanted to produce more carbon quickly, and they asked corporation to build carbon farming. So I don't know. I think I don't have any answer. I would just say I imagine that this is about politics, and that you just have to convince yourself as a government or through democracy that, or by yelling. I absolutely, yeah, I don't have any answer, and I will not try to give you a wrong answer anyway. So, Ryan, you have a...
Do you rephrase the question?
So how do you decentralize decision making? How it can happen? Yeah. Is it possible? Is it easy?
It's not actually centralized, which I think is what you said. So there's this perception that there's a top-down hierarchical structure, but it's not. It's already decentralized. So the idea of polycentricity is a governance structure where you push decision making down to the lowest level. But if you look at all decisions, they're largely political anyway, and actually people participate in the grassroots. So they're not actually centralised. They look centralised, and economists think they're centralised, but they never have been, and they probably never will be. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah.
My question is, maybe you can correct me, but when I read about economic diversification, governments are more concerned about the sectoral, moving business sectors and diversifying that livelihood, say from fishing, farming, or combining ecotourism. So in that aspect, what I've seen there is more
intrasectorial.
Yeah, it's very much that. So I'm just trying to think in terms of what you presented, with what is actually going on there, in terms of you've got 2 different sectors giving different products to it. How do you deal with that?
So, yeah, first thing, I'm not dealing with intersectorial diversification, and that's frequently one of the things that is promoted by some countries. Intrasectorial, it was to, for me, it was a way to speak about the impact of specialization on one product, and before, or in some areas still now, there are a diversification of the extraction inside a given sector. So in Vietnam, I had a discussion recently with a forester at UQ that was telling me that in Vietnam, just you've got areas where they harvest 1, 2, 3 species, another one, another one, 3 other species, etc. And you've got those systems also that have been imposed to plant rubber trees or palm trees, etc. And only that. So you've got different systems that are there. And I was wondering whether the destruction or the promotion or the other of one could be interesting. So basically to compare them. The second question I don't understand exactly. So how do you compare different products?
And if you, for instance, with forestry, you will have different, I would say, ecosystem services per se.
Yeah.
You've got a provisioning, which you just illustrated in the example.
Yeah.
Also, you could have the creation or the cultural services
Oh, yeah, okay.
coming together. So I think what I'm trying to say is practically, when you go to a government or local community, they try to oversee this. Maybe I'm wrong in terms of this concept, but they try to see other services that are also inclusive. So what can we do a tourist who come, you like the forest.
Yeah, yeah.
So they like that part. So you've got this compounding of different services operating, not only mutually exclusive.
Yeah. So first, it would have been very hard for me to do with everything.
Yeah.
But I see there are some ways from the way I'm doing.
Yes.
There are some ways, but indirect. But for instance, by saying that recreation or areas in forest, you usually need probably a bigger forest, and you need more shade or more open. So I can play with the model through indicators, like the leaf area index of the forest. That could be indicators that reflect those type of services. But I reckon that's not easy. I'm far from doing that. Maybe I would never do it. But I fully agree with your point. Just dealing with timber and carbon and livelihood is not enough in many areas, but it's relevant in others where production and basically where people are living from the extraction of resources. There are many areas where, in developing countries, where you rely on that first.
Thank you.
Yes.
If I understand this right, in this example here, there's 8 species and they all have some value.
Yeah.
How do you handle, or have you thought much about species that don't have an economic value or are undesirable for harvest in such a system?
So basically, implicitly, I include that because I define species not in terms of their economic value, but I choose a range of combination of different functional traits. Some are slow growing, some are fast growing, some are even slow growing and low timber or dense timber, light timber or dense timber, and not very tall. So I included 8 types of species, and not all of them could be of interest. I decided in the model to let people choose their species, and I'm selecting one, basically all the possible combination between the good and the bad one. So the non-interesting one. So I tested all the possible combinations possible for this system here. I could have chosen like more species, but it would have been like already it was several days of simulations. It was enough. So am I answering your question?
Yes, I think I understand. But, this wasn't clear to me earlier.
Yeah. So for instance, in the non-strategic blind diversification of extraction, it means that some extractions are absolutely economically useless, but you see that they can be interesting for biodiversity or carbon. But the result is that it doesn't matter sometimes which species you are harvesting actually, so timber supply. Even if you are harvesting always in red the best species, it's a complex native forest system. So you have a lot of forest species. You have a lot of other species. So even if you are harvesting only these highly high yield species, you're not likely to get it after even by planting next year without harvesting or cutting or thinning the other one. So so it's better, and that's probably what people are doing. They're harvesting a bit more, or they are burning, slash and burn. That's one solution. I didn't use that. They slash and burn, they open, and they replant only one species in the middle of the forest. But in other countries, they are harvesting several species. That's probably what's happening. They are building complementarities between species, and they're opening more gaps. And they will wait 10, 20 years, and they will harvest a diversity of species, and not only this one, but at the end, they will have more of these high-yield species, because there will be more light gaps, and this will be the dominant compared to the other one. You understand what I mean?
Yes, I do. So they're not actually maybe going to utilize the full diversity of species that they harvest. Some may be just in the way, and they're cutting them down, or burning them, or something else. It doesn't mean all of those species are desirable for some economic purpose.
Yeah, or it could be like some species are not high-yield species, but they could use it for cultural products that they don't produce a lot, but they produce enough for making money out of it or for their livelihood. So I'm not pretending covering all the possible behaviors that are happening in forest. I'm just given some types of behaviors, weeding, thinning after before harvest, replanting, and just choosing some species for whatever reason, for fuel wood and timber and other products. You're more likely to get, at least if you do that, you're more likely to increase biodiversity by diversifying. But yeah, it could be, I'm pretty sure it's more complex than that. I'm sure, 100%. So you're right in this case to be skeptical. Yes?
Is it a problem for communities in forest commons that a central government might look at them as they're making a livelihood? How do we get taxed out of that? How do we, it's like that means nothing to us. We're not getting anything out of it. But I guess your work is saying if they are actually getting stuff out of it, like their biodiversity sort of stuff. But I don't think many governments think that way.
I think the first, that's as I tried to cite in the presentation, we have to put ourselves in the governance shoes. So it's first, it's complicated to trust local people sometimes for some stuff. Even if Ryan says that it's not completely centralized, I don't agree completely when you see European Union forcing people basically to abandon or set aside some lands with very strong incentives. You're pretty much, you're even tracked by a GPS system and satellite. So I was working in Farmer's Place during my PhD, and literally they had a satellite coming, and they knew next year that if they didn't set aside enough land for forest, they will have a reduction of the money for next year that they receive from the Common Agricultural Policy. So there are some taxes that are imposed, but what you're saying is that because they provide a service, maybe they could receive money for that? Is it that?
Well, I'm saying that you're at least showing that they don't have to keep the people out to get biodiversity outcomes, so they can stay there.
Yeah, well, I said for this system, yes. I'm not saying that for all systems.
That's right.
so they could get money for providing services for
But
biodiversity.
also if they're at the same time clearing places, but also setting places aside, yeah, they can count the places with people in them as parks, essentially,
As what?
as national parks or protected areas.
Yeah. So
Even though they've got people.
so I don't understand exactly what you mean.
We should, I think it's for, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt it. It's 4:15, so can I just let you to discuss that and let everyone go for beers and
Better discussing over here.
yeah. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.